Throughout human history, the question of who may speak for the divine has been fiercely contested and carefully controlled. Sacred texts, presented as repositories of ultimate truth, have shaped civilizations, justified wars, and determined the spiritual worth of billions. Yet, a critical examination reveals that these texts represent not universal divine revelation, but rather the documented experiences of specific peoples at specific historical moments, predominantly those with the literacy, institutional power, and social standing to have their words preserved and elevated to canonical status. The restriction of sacred authorship to ancient, predominantly male, predominantly elite voices has created profound imbalances that continue to limit human potential. By excluding the vast majority of human spiritual experience from the category of sacred text, we have constructed systems of dependency that serve ideological, economic, and cultural interests while denying the inherent spiritual authority of each individual. The politics of canonization. The formation of religious canons was never a neutral or purely spiritual process, whether we examine the Council of Nicaea's determination of Christian scripture, the compilation of the Vedas by Brahmin priests, or the standardization of Islamic hadith collections. We find consistent patterns. Those with institutional power determined whose revelations would be preserved as sacred and whose would be dismissed as apocryphal, heretical, or simply forgotten. This process of selection inherently reflected the biases, interests, and worldviews of those doing the selecting. Women's mystical writings were often excluded or attributed to male authors. Indigenous cosmologies were dismissed as primitive mythology. The spiritual insights of enslaved peoples, peasants, and colonized populations were systematically devalued. The result is a global religious landscape where the category of scripture overwhelmingly represents the perspectives of ancient Near Eastern and South Asian elite men. Literacy as gatekeeping. The very medium of written text served as a mechanism of exclusion. For most of human history, literacy was the privilege of a small minority. Priestly classes, scribal guilds, and religious institutions controlled not only what could be written, but who could write. Oral traditions, while rich and spiritually profound, were relegated to secondary status or actively suppressed as cultures encountered literate religious traditions backed by imperial power. This literacy barrier had profound implications for whose spiritual experiences could be elevated to scriptural status. The visions of illiterate mystics, the wisdom of non-literate indigenous elders, the prayers of women denied education, all were excluded from the permanent, authoritative form of sacred text. When these voices were occasionally recorded, they were typically mediated through literate intermediaries who shaped, edited, and often distorted the original insights. One of the most significant ideological consequences of restricted sacred authorship is the presentation of culturally specific experiences as universal truth. When the Hebrew Bible's patriarchal family structures are treated as divinely ordained rather than historically contingent, when the Buddha's renunciant path is presented as the singular route to enlightenment regardless of social context, when the Qur'an's 7th-century Arabian legal frameworks are applied universally across vastly different cultures and eras, we see the elevation of particular human experiences to the status of cosmic law. This universalization limits human potential by suggesting that authentic spiritual life must conform to ancient templates. Individuals whose experiences don't align with canonical narratives, whose family structures differ, whose social roles are unrecognized, whose psychological experiences don't match described spiritual states, are left to conclude either that they are spiritually deficient or that their authentic experiences are somehow less valid than those documented in Scripture. The silencing of feminine and non-binary spiritual authority. Perhaps nowhere is the ideological imbalance more evident than in the overwhelming masculine dominance of sacred texts. Major world religions elevate male prophets, avatars, and sages while systematically excluding or minimizing women's spiritual authority. When feminine voices appear in scripture, they are often filtered through male authorship, relegated to supporting roles, or praised specifically for conforming to patriarchal ideals. This exclusion has profound consequences. It suggests that divine revelation flows primarily through male consciousness, that women's spiritual experiences are derivative or secondary, and that gender hierarchies have cosmic sanction. The result is centuries of women being told their spiritual insights are less authoritative, their mystical experiences suspect, their theological contributions invalid, not because these contributions lack depth or truth, but because the gatekeepers of sacred text authority were and largely remain male. The erasure extends to non-binary and gender-diverse spiritual experiences. Two-spirit peoples, Hijra communities and other gender-variant individuals across cultures have often held significant spiritual roles, yet their perspectives are almost entirely absent from canonical sacred texts. Their exclusion reinforces rigid gender binaries as spiritually normative, limiting the potential of all people to explore the full spectrum of human spiritual experience. Colonial implications and indigenous erasure. The global spread of text-based religions accompanied and often justified colonial expansion. Indigenous peoples worldwide were told their oral traditions were inferior to written scripture, their cosmologies mere superstition, compared to revealed truth. The imposition of foreign sacred texts was part of a larger project of cultural destruction that severed peoples from their ancestral wisdom, languages, and spiritual practices. This represents not just historical injustice, but ongoing limitation of human potential. Indigenous knowledge systems, developed over millennia in intimate relationship with specific ecosystems and communities, contain profound spiritual and practical wisdom. Their exclusion from the category of sacred text means this wisdom is devalued, forgotten, or accessible only through the distorting lens of anthropological study, rather than living spiritual practice. The institutional capture of divine access. Religious institutions have long recognized that controlling access to sacred texts and their interpretation represents enormous economic power. The Catholic Church's restriction of Bible reading to clergy, the Hindu Brahmin class's monopoly on Vedic knowledge, the Islamic ulama's gatekeeping of religious law. These patterns repeat across traditions because they serve clear material interests. When ordinary people are told they cannot directly access divine truth without institutional mediation, they become dependent on priests, scholars, and religious organizations. This dependency takes concrete economic forms: tithes and offerings, fees for sacraments and ceremonies, payments for religious education, purchases of authorized interpretations and commentaries. The religious economy is built on the premise that spiritual authority resides in institutions rather than individuals. The commodification of spiritual guidance. Modern religious markets have only intensified this dynamic. Bookstores overflow with texts claiming to explain what ancient scriptures really mean, with each new interpretation requiring new purchases. Spiritual retreats promise access to authentic religious experience. For a fee, celebrity religious teachers build empires by positioning themselves as necessary intermediaries between seekers and truth. This commodification creates perverse incentives. There is little profit in telling people they already possess spiritual authority and need only trust their own experience. There is enormous profit in maintaining systems where authentic religious life requires constant consumption of expert interpretation, authorized practices, and institutional validation. Economic barriers to spiritual participation. The economic dimension extends beyond direct religious commerce. Religious institutions often require significant financial investment for full participation. Membership dues, building funds, costs of religious education for children, expenses for appropriate attire and ritual objects. While many traditions maintain ideals of accessibility, the reality is that fuller participation typically correlates with greater financial contribution. This creates economic barriers to spiritual community and authority. Those with fewer resources have less access to religious education, less ability to take on leadership roles that require financial flexibility, and less influence within institutions where wealth confers status. The result is that even the interpretation of supposedly egalitarian spiritual teachings becomes shaped by the economically advantaged. The narrowing of spiritual imagination. When only certain types of spiritual experiences are validated as sacred, our collective spiritual imagination narrows. We lose access to the full range of human encounters with mystery, transcendence, and meaning. The mystic poetry of Sufi saints represents one mode of divine encounter, but so do the trance dances of sand peoples, the vision quests of plains nations, the dream wisdom of Aboriginal Australians, and countless other practices excluded from, or marginalized within, the canonical sacred literature of dominant religions. This narrowing limits what we imagine spiritual experience can be. If authentic mysticism must match Teresa of Avila's ecstasies or Ramakrishna's visions, we may dismiss our own encounters with the sacred as insufficient. If divine communication must resemble Moses' burning bush or Muhammad's angelic visitation, we may fail to recognize the sacred speaking in our own idiom. Through synchronicity, through dreams, through the voices of ancestors, through direct knowing that comes in silence. The loss of contextual spiritual wisdom. Sacred texts emerged from specific cultural contexts and addressed specific historical circumstances. The Hebrew prophets spoke to the political crises of ancient Israel. The Buddha addressed the spiritual questions of northern India's renunciant movement. Jesus taught within the apocalyptic Judaism of Roman-occupied Palestine. These contexts shaped the form and content of what became scripture. Yet when these texts are universalized and divorced from context, we lose crucial wisdom. We also fail to generate new sacred wisdom appropriate to our own contexts. What is the sacred text for communities facing climate catastrophe? What scripture speaks to the spiritual dimensions of artificial intelligence? What divine wisdom addresses the peculiar alienation of late capitalism? These questions cannot be adequately answered by ancient texts alone, yet we have few frameworks for recognizing contemporary spiritual insight as genuinely sacred. Cultural supremacy and spiritual imperialism. The elevation of certain sacred texts to universal status has often accompanied cultural imperialism. Christianity's global spread involved not just evangelization but the systematic devaluation of indigenous spiritual traditions. Islam's expansion sometimes meant the marginalization of pre-existing wisdom traditions. Hinduism's modern forms have sometimes enforced upper caste textual interpretations over lower caste and Dalit spiritual practices. This represents a form of spiritual monoculture that impoverishes us all. Just as agricultural monoculture creates vulnerability and reduces biodiversity, spiritual monoculture limits our collective capacity to find meaning, navigate crisis, and imagine alternative futures. When we lose indigenous cosmologies, when we silence marginalized spiritual voices, when we insist that ancient Near Eastern metaphors are the only valid language for the sacred, we lose irreplaceable human wisdom. Democratizing sacred authorship. Personal testament writing begins with a simple but radical premise. Every human life contains sacred wisdom worthy of documentation and transmission. Every family, every culture, and every nation has sacred wisdom worthy of documentation and transmission. Your struggles with faith, your moments of transcendence, your ethical questions, your encounters with suffering and joy, these are not spiritually inferior to the experiences documented in ancient texts. They are simply more recent, more contextually relevant to contemporary life, and more directly yours. By encouraging individuals, families, cultures, and nations to write their own sacred texts, we democratize spiritual authority. We challenge the notion that divine revelation ceased in antiquity or flows only through officially recognized prophets. We validate the spiritual insights of the poor, the marginalized, the colonized, the feminine, the queer, all those whose experiences have been excluded from canonical scripture. This is not to suggest that ancient wisdom has no value or that tradition should be discarded. Rather, it is to place traditional texts in conversation with contemporary sacred writing rather than above it. The Bhagavad Gita's insights on Dharma can inform our thinking without foreclosing our own revelations about right action in our time. The Gospel's radical compassion can inspire without requiring us to dismiss our own encounters with unconditional love. Breaking economic dependency. When individuals, families, cultures, and nations claim the authority to write their own sacred texts, they break the economic dependency on religious institutions and spiritual authorities. You do not need to purchase the latest commentary on Romans to understand your spiritual life. You do not need to pay for access to a guru's interpretation of the Upanishads. You do not need institutional validation to recognize your own spiritual experiences as valid and meaningful. This has concrete economic implications. Time and money spent consuming others' spiritual interpretations can be redirected toward authentic spiritual practice and community building. Rather than supporting industries built on spiritual insecurity, individuals can invest in direct spiritual engagement and the creation of new sacred wisdom. Moreover, personal, family, cultural, and national testament writing can disrupt the credentialing systems that restrict religious leadership to those with access to expensive seminary education. If sacred insight can emerge from lived experience, rather than only from textual scholarship, then spiritual authority becomes accessible to all, regardless of economic status or educational privilege. Cultural reclamation and innovation. For communities whose spiritual traditions have been suppressed, marginalized, or colonized, personal testament writing offers a path toward reclamation. Rather than waiting for permission from dominant religious institutions to have their experiences recognized as sacred, individuals and communities can claim that authority themselves. Indigenous peoples can document their spiritual insights in forms that honor both traditional wisdom and contemporary experience. Women can write sacred texts that center feminine spiritual authority without requiring male mediation or validation. Queer and transgender individuals can create scripture that affirms their experiences of the divine in their full embodied reality. The formerly colonized can generate sacred literature in their own languages, drawing on their own cosmologies, addressing their own spiritual questions. This cultural innovation also allows for the creation of sacred texts that address contemporary challenges. We can write scriptures of ecological wisdom for an age of environmental crisis. We can craft sacred narratives of technological ethics as we navigate artificial intelligence and genetic engineering. We can document the spiritual dimensions of migration, diaspora, and cultural hybridity in a globalized world, creating sacred space and time. Writing one's own sacred text requires intentionality and reverence. This is not merely journaling or creative writing, but the conscious documentation of spiritual insight intended for transmission. Many practitioners find it valuable to create ritual conditions, a dedicated space for writing, regular time set apart for the practice, perhaps opening ceremonies or prayers that mark the transition from ordinary to sacred writing. The specific forms these rituals take should emerge from individual or community spiritual frameworks, rather than prescribed formulas. What matters is the establishment of psychological and spiritual boundaries that signal the importance of the work, and create conditions for deeper insight to emerge. Forms and structures. Personal testaments can take many forms. Some may choose to write in the literary styles of traditional scripture, psalms, parables, wisdom sayings, prophetic oracles, mystical poetry. Others may develop entirely new forms appropriate to their experience and context. Meditation transcripts, ethical case studies, sacred autobiography, revelatory letters, doctrinal exploration, ritual scripts. The key is finding forms that honor both the content of one's spiritual experience and the cultural context from which one writes. A hip-hop artist might write sacred texts in the form of rap lyrics. A scientist might document spiritual insights emerging from laboratory work. A grandmother might craft wisdom teachings drawn from decades of family life and community service. Sources of sacred insight. What qualifies as material for sacred text writing? The answer is, anything that connects you to ultimate meaning, to the transcendent, to what you hold most sacred. This might include moments of direct mystical experience or transcendent awareness, dreams and visions that carry symbolic or spiritual significance, ethical struggles and the insights gained from navigating moral complexity, experiences of suffering that crack open conventional understanding, encounters with death, birth, and transition, observations of nature that reveal deeper patterns or truths, relational experiences that embody divine love or justice, ancestral wisdom transmitted through family or community intelligence, cultural practices that connect past, present, and future, intellectual insights that integrate spiritual and worldly knowing. The practice involves learning to recognize the sacred dimensions of ordinary experience and to trust that your encounters with mystery are as valid as those documented in ancient texts. Community and transmission. While personal testament writing emphasizes individual spiritual authority, it need not be solitary. Communities can gather to share sacred texts, offer witness to one another's spiritual journeys, and collectively develop bodies of sacred literature that reflect their shared values and experiences. The question of transmission is crucial. If these texts are truly sacred, how should they be preserved and shared? Some may choose to keep them private, as personal spiritual documents. Others may share them within small communities of practice. Still others may seek broader publication and dissemination, contributing to the growing body of contemporary sacred literature. Digital technologies offer new possibilities for the transmission of sacred texts. Online communities can share, discuss, and build upon one another's spiritual writings. Multimedia forms allow the integration of visual, auditory, and textual elements. Translation technologies can make sacred texts accessible across language barriers, though always with attention to the losses inherent in translation. The question of quality. Critics may argue that unrestricted sacred authorship will produce texts of inferior quality compared to canonized scripture. This criticism reveals the assumption that quality is determined by age, institutional validation, or conformity to established literary forms. In reality, The sacred texts we revere vary enormously in literary quality and often contain contradictions, historical errors, and ethically problematic material. Quality in sacred writing should be measured not by conformity to ancient models, but by capacity to evoke spiritual insight, ethical transformation, and encounter with the transcendent. A simple, unpolished testimony to profound spiritual experience may be far more valuable than elegant prose that merely imitates scriptural style. Moreover, the democratization of sacred authorship will naturally produce texts of varying quality, just as traditional canons contain texts of varying profundity. The solution is not to restrict authorship, but to develop discernment and critical engagement with all sacred texts, old and new. The risk of spiritual narcissism. Another concern is that personal testament writing might encourage spiritual narcissism or relativism, with everyone claiming divine authority for their preferred beliefs and practices. This is a legitimate concern that requires serious attention. The antidote lies in approaching personal testament writing with humility and critical self-reflection. Writing one's sacred text should involve wrestling with doubt, examining one's biases, and remaining open to correction from community, tradition, and lived experience. It should also involve recognition that one's personal sacred text is not necessarily binding on others. It represents one's own best understanding of spiritual truth, offered for dialogue rather than imposed as dogma. Furthermore, personal testament writing can actually reduce narcissism by disrupting the passive consumption of religious authority. Actively wrestling with spiritual questions and documenting one's insights requires far more self-examination than simply accepting handed-down beliefs. Respect for tradition. Some may worry that encouraging personal sacred text writing devalues traditional scripture and religious heritage. This need not be the case. Personal testament writing can exist in creative tension with tradition, drawing on ancient wisdom while contributing new insights. Many practitioners find that writing their own sacred texts deepens their engagement with traditional scripture. The process of articulating one's own spiritual understanding creates new appreciation for how ancient authors wrestled with similar questions. The challenges of writing sacred text build empathy for the limitations and contexts of canonical authors. The goal is not to replace traditional texts, but to place them in conversation with contemporary sacred writing, recognizing both as human attempts to articulate encounters with the divine. Spiritual liberation. The restriction of sacred authorship to ancient, predominantly elite, predominantly male voices has created ideological, economic, and cultural imbalances that limit human spiritual potential. By excluding the vast majority of human experience from the category of sacred text, we have constructed systems of dependency that serve institutional interests while denying the inherent spiritual authority of individuals and marginalized communities. Personal testament writing offers a path toward spiritual liberation. By democratizing sacred authorship, we challenge the monopolization of divine access, disrupt economic exploitation of spiritual seeking, and create space for cultural wisdom that has been systematically excluded from canonical scripture. We honor the full breadth of human spiritual experience and generate sacred wisdom appropriate to contemporary challenges. This is not a call to abandon tradition or dismiss ancient wisdom. Rather, it is an invitation to recognize that sacred texts are not relics of a past age of revelation, but living documents that continue to be written wherever humans encounter the transcendent, wrestle with meaning, and seek to articulate their deepest spiritual insights. Your life is a sacred text waiting to be written. Your experiences of suffering and joy, your ethical struggles, your moments of transcendence, your questions that have no easy answers. These are the raw material of Scripture. The task before us is not to wait for permission from ancient authorities or modern institutions, but to claim the spiritual authority that belongs to every human being and to write the testaments of our age. In doing so, we do not diminish the sacred but expand it. We do not weaken spiritual tradition but allow it to breathe and evolve. We do not promote spiritual narcissism, but take responsibility for our own spiritual formation. And we create the possibility of a future where no one's sacred story is excluded, no one's spiritual wisdom is dismissed, and the full potential of human encounter with the divine can finally be recognized and celebrated. Stop depending. Begin declaring. Get your copy of Testaments of God today at cosmofield.com and make the world a better place. Have you considered writing your family, cultural, or national testament of God? What is holding you back? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. And if this resonates with you, subscribe for more insights on the transformation of consciousness.